I'm an addict called Vito. I got a cold, so I'm a little nasal, and with my Bronx accent, I hope you can understand me. Because sometimes here in the Midwest, even without a cold, I can't be understood. Where'd you say you were from? Miami. You don't sound like you're from Miami. But I grew up in the Bronx, and my accent's the result of where I grew up. I'd like to thank the convention committee for asking me to come here and share. It's always an honor and a privilege to be able to share at an NA function of any sort, whether it's a group, convention, any type of event, because it's actually an honor. Because without you folks, I wouldn't be clean today. I'd like to thank Tom for introducing me. In 1990, I moved a lot faster than I do today. I was a kid then. I was only 50 years old. But I'm still alive. I still go to 4 meetings a week, and I do my best to stay involved in this fellowship. It's not like years ago where I had a job and wasn't retired and money kept coming in. I could go all over the place. Today, I hope the young people get involved and keep this fellowship on track, because it is a we type thing. But I can guarantee one thing: wherever direction this fellowship goes, people will recover in Narcotics Anonymous. And Narcotics Anonymous will get better and bigger no matter which way we go. But that's not what I'm here for today. Well, I'm here to share my experience, strength, and hope. And I'm going to qualify for 5-6 minutes and tell you how it was. I can't educate you on how it was. You all were there. Maybe your dumpster was different than my dumpster, and your drug of choice was different than my drug of choice. But, somehow it all led to the same place. I go back a lot of years. I was born before the Second World War, and probably that's long before your parents were even born. And I grew up in a Latin family and a one-parent family, which was unusual back there. And my mother was the first liberated woman in the world. I always say that because, if my father would have paid support, she probably wouldn't have taken it. So she worked a number of jobs to keep things going. And even though she thought she was doing the right thing, that allowed me to be out in the streets at a very, very young age. And I used to sit on the stoop of the apartment building in the Bronx where I grew up. And I was the youngest kid out there because everybody else had families and they were in bed, but I wanted to be outside with the big guys. And so to fit in, I became somewhat of the neighborhood clown. I would do all the errands. I would do everything to fit in, and they would reward me. And the first reward that they gave me was the liquid drug alcohol, and I hated it because it made me sick. But damn it, I wanted to fit in, so I pursued. Within a year or so, I was doing not only pot, I was doing something was on the streets in New York, and you probably haven't heard from it unless you were in New York, called Carbona. And what it was is dry cleaning fluid. And all of us young kids in elementary school, we would soak our handkerchiefs in Carbona, and we'd be sniffing our handkerchiefs all day long. And I remember one teacher that was transferred into our school, she says, "This neighborhood is really odd. Everybody's got a continuous cold." Because every kid in the class is sniffing their handkerchiefs all day long. And, of course, by the time I was 10 years old, I graduated to start mainlining heroin, and I did what I had to do to support my habit. And I knew I was different than other people because even though I didn't know how I was different, I knew that I did things that were different than other people. I remember once we were playing a card game. One of my buddies, his father was a super in a building in New York. What a super is they get a free apartment and they take care of the building. And so they have the run of the basement because their apartment's usually in the basement. So we're hanging there and we're playing cards. And while we're playing cards, one of our buddies in the corner was playing his own game called Russian Roulette. And he won. He blew his brains out in front of us. And the only feelings that any of us had is one of annoyance because we had to get up and move the card game somewhere else. And I knew at that time something was different about me. Today I know what it was. My feelings were frozen. I didn't have the ability to feel. And I used every day from the first day I picked up. Until in 1956 I got involved in a gun battle in a place called Orchard Beach in the Bronx. And when the man came, we threw the pieces in the Sound, with Long Island Sound. And I took off through this wooded area knowing that on the other side of the woods was a place called City Island where I could get a bus back to the main part of the Bronx. And being the smart addict that I am, I take off through these woods, and I find myself in the middle of New York City Summer Police Academy. Now, rookies in New York, until they become full-fledged cops, they wore these gray uniforms to distinguish them between the regular cops. So I had all these gray people coming at me. And this was late in the day now, so they put me in a paddy wagon, and they took me downtown to Manhattan to be arraigned at night court. And when I got arraigned in night court, they told me I had to go to the Tubes overnight, which was a jail in Manhattan, until they could transfer me the next day up to Bronx County. And I went in that jail that night feeling okay, and I woke up that morning detoxing. And when you detox from opiates, it's like having razor blades in your stomach. And you want to get in that fetal position. And I remember the guards getting me up and taking me down to the paddy wagon because I had to be transferred up to Bronx County. And when I got to Bronx County, I had to go into intake, and I had to get my clothes and everything that was issued to me. In the meantime, I'm heaving, and nobody paid attention to me because it was like just another jerk off the streets. And when I got up to my cell, I had a beautiful view of Yankee Stadium, although I never saw it because I was on the floor in a fetal position, banging my head on the bars, trying to create pain up here so I couldn't feel it in my gut. And I detoxed in that cell. And after I was there for 30 days, I was called before a meeting before the Bronx County District Attorney, and they offered me a deal. And you know, addicts, we love that word deal. My ears perked up a little bit, and they said, Vito, if you would leave the state of New York, we will offer you probation. So I immediately moved across the river to Jersey City, New Jersey. And I got myself a furnished room in a place called Journal Square, because at Journal Square there was the Tubes, which is a subway from Jersey into Manhattan. I could be in New York every day. So nothing really changed for me, except I was clean now. And I said, now that I'm clean, I'm only going to use on weekends because I could be the dealer I want, the gangster I want. And that lasted for 2 weeks. And the next 4 years was all blackout, and I can't tell you much about it. I lived on railroad tracks, riverbanks, wherever I could, but it ended on February 14th, 1960, in a gutter in Brick Church Station, New Jersey. And I had crawled out of the dumpster that this high-class heroin addict was living in. I was too sick to get my drug of choice, so I would sift through the dumpster to find mouthwash or bay rum hair tonic and sift it through stale bread to get the alcohol out of it. And on that day, I left my dumpster trying to find something, and I collapsed in a gutter outside of Brick Church Station. And it was snowing. The snow was covering my body. And it was a very busy area because the commuter trains would come in from Manhattan there, and people would get off the trains, come out of the station to go to their parking lot, and they would step over me like I didn't exist. And I think everybody in this room knows what it is to feel like a none person in a crowd of people. But somebody had some compassion on me, and they called an ambulance. And back then, it was an effort to call an ambulance because you had to go find a phone booth, then you had to take money out of your pocket and drop it in to call an ambulance. It's not like today. And somebody called an ambulance, and they came, and they picked me up, and they took me to the emergency room. And when I got there, I was treated the way I was treated my entire life. The doctors took one look at me, and they refused to treat me. They said to the nurses, delouse him before we would look at him, because I was covered with body lice. And when they deloused me, and they examined me and found out I was suffering from both infectious and serum hepatitis, from dirty living and dirty needles. And because I was infectious and contagious, I had to be put in what was known as an isolation ward. Now, I was admitted into the hospital in what they call service. Service was a very pretty word for welfare back then. And so I couldn't afford a real doctor or anything like that. So they assigned to me what I called a half doctor. It was an intern who was doing his residency in this country from Greece. And he would come in all the time, and he would talk to me and, ask me why I live this way and all this. You know how earth people talk to you. And then it was time for me to get out of that place, and he said to me, I want to offer you a deal. Now, the word deal, for an addict, your ears perk up again. He said, the man's been coming here. He wants to talk to you from the condition they found you in, the way you were living. And we won't let him in here because you're contagious, but you're getting out of here. Now, if you will sign these papers, we have a place upstairs for people similar to you. Now, I didn't know what similar meant. I didn't know what upstairs meant, but I knew it was still cold out. It was in the northeastern part of this country. It was still winter time. So I figure upstairs is still good. It's cold outside. My dumpster has probably been occupied by somebody else. So I signed the papers, and when it was time for me to go up there, the nurses come in and get me, and we're wearing these green hospital gowns. And we get into the elevator, and I have all my worldly possessions in a brown paper bag. And we get on the elevator, and we go up to the 7th floor, and the elevator opens up. And it opens up to a room about the quarter size, maybe a little smaller of this room. And there was bed after bed after bed after bed. And I says to the nurse, what is this place? And she says, well, this is an alcoholic ward. And I looked at her in disbelief. I said, you're going to put me with those sick people? They got a problem. They can't stop drinking. And she says, well, you're an addict, aren't you? I says, yeah, but there's a difference. I can stop using anytime I wanted to. I just don't want to. I think everybody in this room has made that statement at one time or another. And she says, well, I have a solution for you. Take your brown paper bag and leave. You don't have to come in here. Now, I'm not stupid, but I'm not the brightest bulb on the street because it's still cold out. So I said, okay, I'll go in there, but I'm just going to do my time. And to me, time was until it got warm. And so I go in and I find the bed way in the back that's empty. And I figured nobody going to bother me because I'm not going to talk to these people. They're sick. They got a problem. I mean, I'm well, but I'm not going to convince them to get well. Instead of going out and getting drunk, just go out and get some nice drugs and nod out a little bit. But why waste your time? Because they got a problem. They're sick. They wouldn't understand the intelligence of this great person. So I get myself a bed in the back, and I'm not going to get friends with people there. But this old guy comes up to me, and he just talks and talks and talks. And, like he was on a first-name basis with God. He could end the Cold War. He knew everything there was to know. Today I realize he was just like me. Like attracts like. But I figured, well, this guy talking to me, he's just an old man. He really don't know much. He was about 40 and I was in my 20s. And you know how the 40-year-old looks to a 20-year-old, they're ready to die. I wish I could go back to 40 now. But twice a week, these people came in and they brought a meeting. It wasn't this fellowship, it was another fellowship. And so I informed the nurses in my infinite wisdom that on Wednesday night when these people came in, I would go down to the solarium and watch TV. And they said to me, you're going to that meeting or take your brown paper bag and leave. It's still cold out. So I go to the meeting and I would go to the back of the room with my back against the wall because back in those days, you never had your back exposed. It was part of the code of the street. You sat at a table, your back was towards the wall. You stood up, your back. You always had your back covered. So I'd be in the back of the room, have my back covered, and these people would come in and they just have this message. And I used to sit back there and laugh at them. They talked about drinking and getting drunk and blackouts. And I says, come on. Stop drinking. You guys don't have a real problem. But I had to be there, so I went there. Then finally, one day this old man was being released from this facility. And we wore these green hospital gowns. So he had to go into the back room and put his street clothes on. And when he came out, he was dressed as a Skid Row bum. He had an old pea coat on with the elbows out. His pants had holes in them. His shoes had holes in them. And I looked into that man's eyes, and for the first time I realized there was no difference between me and him except our drug of choice. Oh, he'd get off on Thunderbird or Sneaky Pete or Muscatel, and I'd get off on any damn thing I get my hands on. And I realized from that time on, there wasn't much difference between me and those people except the drug of choice. And so when these people started to come in, I started to listen. And I could get beyond the substance and identify with the feelings. And then it was time for me to leave that facility. I was still homeless. I still owned just my brown paper bag. But those people told me the magic words before I left. They said, if you show up to our meetings, we got coffee and cookies. Now, when you're homeless, that's a pretty big invite. So the first night I was out, I showed up at one of their meetings, and I walk in. Now, you got to remember, this is 1960. Everybody standing in there had jackets on and ties. Hardly any women in the meeting. And here I come in with hair down to my butt, my Garrison belt razor sharp. I got spikes sticking out of my boots. And the guy turns around and he says, hey, kid, what are you doing here? And I explained to him, I just got out of this hospital, and they gave me this meeting list, and they said if I come here, I could get coffee and cookies. And he says, well, the coffee and cookies are there, kid, but this is a closed meeting for alcoholics only, and people like you don't get better. You have a disease that is immoral. You have a disease that is illegal, and there's no hope for people like you. And they took my meeting list and he circled meetings that were called open meetings. And he said, kid, you could go to those open meetings, but don't waste your time. People like you don't get better, they die. Well, one thing you don't do is tell an addict not to come back. So I would show up at these great big open meetings, and they were great big speaker meetings. You know, in 1960, there was more and more people like me that came off the street and started showing up there. And we knew subconsciously that we belonged to each other because we look at each other and we had that same look. We had long, dirty hair, greasy skin, dirty clothes, and we'd stand in front of the meetings and we'd share deeply with each other like, hey man, what's happening? We go into a meeting would end, see you tomorrow. Next day, hey man, what's happening? But we sort of knew we belonged to each other because we would sit down and everybody would move to the other side of the room. They're afraid to catch what we had. In late 1962 or 63, I can't really remember, I was sitting in a meeting of that fellowship and somebody came up and tapped me on the shoulder and called me by the nickname that I had gotten in that fellowship. They said, hey, animal, there's a drug meeting in the back room. Now, I had no idea what a drug meeting was, but it sounded interesting, so myself and the herd of animals, we went back there. And for those of you in this room that can remember the 1960s, and there's a few of you, there was a bunch of people that had long hair like we did, except their hair was clean. Girls had flowers in their hair and skirts down to their ankles. They had T-shirts like we did, except they had these big peace signs painted on them. And they were the love children, the hippies of that generation, which were totally different than us street people. But they had sat there, and this one particular guy opened up the meeting, and he said they had got clean in San Diego, California, and that's where this group of hippies was from. It's something called Narcotics Anonymous. And they opened up the meeting, and they don't have literature like we had today. And they opened up their meeting, and they started to share. And all of a sudden, I started hearing my thinking coming out of their mouth. And then the guys that I shared in the meetings with, or stayed outside the meetings with, they started to share, and I heard my thinking coming out of their mouth. And from that point on, I knew I would never be alone, never again. Because up till that time, I thought I was insane. There was nobody else like me in the world. Nobody could understand what I'm feeling. And I realized there were other people just like me. And when the hippies moved on, we tried to start NA meetings. but we had a few things against us. There were laws in the New York metropolitan area called Rockefeller laws. If two or more addicts gathered together, clean or using, you could get busted. So we tried to keep meetings going in secret. And then there was another organization that came out of the 40s in New York City. It was called Narcotics Anonymous also. It was a different fellowship, not this fellowship, started by Danny Carlson. And one of his sidekicks, after he met a girl named Ray Lopez, had started an NA meeting in Passaic, New Jersey, from that NA thing. And we used to go over there once a week when that meeting was going on. And it was a lot like we have today, except that NA did not have traditions or believed in it. And so the rest of the week, we'd go where we'd have to, and we started these NA meetings in secret, and we would go to the AA meetings, and we'd spot the addicts in there, because, you know, you're an addict, you know how easy it is to spot another addict, and we would proselyte them out of AA and bring them to our meetings. Things were different then. It wasn't about attraction, it was about persuasion. But the only problem was, you know, we had clean time, but we had no recovery. I mean, everybody would sit around and wait for somebody to relapse so you could roll them. That was perfectly okay because you didn't use. The whole thinking and culture was different. We had no idea that recovery meant change. Then one day we went to the AA meeting to proselyte some guys, and we found 3 guys. 2 of them had just got out of a new facility in Manhattan called Phoenix House, and another one got out of another facility called Daytop, and we brought them back to our NA, and they assured us they knew everything there was about recovery because they just spent 90 days in those in those facilities, and they graduated, and they were going to tell us how to have structure in our meetings. They said it's very simple. When somebody shares something sick, everybody gang up on them and confront them, and that's how people stay clean. So we tried it, and chairs went across the room, and tables went across the room. Obviously, that didn't work either. But I had kept in contact with one of these hippies who had gone back to San Diego, and I would call him up once a week. You know, back then we didn't have cell phones, and it cost money to make long-distance calls. But if you were a street person, you learned if you found the phone booth and you take the top of the phone thing, the receiver part, and take the speaker out, there was 2 prongs in there. And you would dial operator and say, I want San Diego, blah, blah, whatever the number is. And she'd say, deposit 75 cents. You take those 2 prongs and you hit it against the coin box, and they go ding, 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 just like you're putting money in. So it's just like having a cell phone. So I call this guy up once a week, and, you know, I'm complaining to him, we ain't got this NA thing going, and we're not as lucky as you guys, and so forth. So he says, why don't you come out to San Diego? And I thought he was like nuts. I said, what do you mean, me come? I got a living to make here. He said, what do you mean you got a living to make? You don't work. I said, but you got to understand, back in those days, if you were an addict or an alcoholic, they considered you disabled, and they'd put you on welfare and send you 2 checks a month. So I said to him, I do got a living. The state sends me 2 checks a month. I go down to the pool hall. I play 9-ball all day long. I parlay my money. I got a job. Shooting pool. He says, don't worry about it, Vito. We got welfare in California, and we got pool rooms too. So I remember I hitchhiked across the country. It was a Wednesday morning. I arrived in San Diego, find me a phone booth, do my deal. I call him up on the phone. I said, I'm here. He said, where are you at? I told him. He said, I'll pick you up in a few minutes. And he came down, picked me up, and he took me to his pad in a place called Old Town in San Diego. And we sat there all day long, and he said, Vito, we got 2 meetings a week here in San Diego. We got a Wednesday and a Friday meeting. Today's Wednesday. You're in luck. We have a meeting tonight. Meantime, all day long, people coming in and out of his house. And about 6 o'clock, we go out, and about 15 of us pile in his Volkswagen bus. I don't know if too many of you remember the Volkswagen buses. But about 15 of us pile in there, and we go to a place called Mission Hill in San Diego, a great big Catholic church. And we're getting out of the Volkswagen bus, and he grabs me, and he says, now, Vito, when you get out in the parking lot, do not mention Narcotics Anonymous or NA. I said, what are you talking about? I thought we're going to an NA meeting. He says, we are, but the priests don't run to any damn addicts. They think we're AA, so just keep your mouth shut. It shows you addicts can get what they want when they want it. The Friday meeting, we had no problem with our landlord. They welcomed us as long as we paid the rent. It was the Black Panther Clubhouse. But the rest of the week, we had to go where we had to go for recovery. But those of us that went to NA, we stuck together like glue. And we talked about the NA way of doing the steps, which is totally different than any other fellowship. And now this is where I got to get honest and tell on myself. Now, I got a few years clean now. I never had a sponsor. I never worked the steps, because I'd be damned if I had some sick person to sponsor me, because I was unique and different and weller than everybody else. The only problem was people were coming in after me and getting their lives together, and I was still jonesing on a regular basis. So I said to myself, maybe there is something to these steps and sponsorship. So I asked this guy if he'll sponsor me. He says, yeah, Vito, I'll sponsor you. Where are you with the steps? I looked at him like he was nuts. What do you mean, where was I with the steps? I've heard them read every night for a few years. I'm done. Now, we do know a few people like that today, too. He says, okay, you're done with the steps. Tell me about the first step. He says, I've been powerless over drugs and my life was unmanageable. What's there else to say? He said, Vito, where does it say drugs in the first step? So I pick up this off-colored white book that we had, and I read, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction. I said, addiction, drugs, what the hell's the difference? He said, I'll tell you what the difference is. Addiction is a disease of personality, a disease of negativity, a disease of not wanting to deal with life on life's term, a disease of running. Drugs is something you put in your body. Addiction is something that lies between your ears. And I looked at that man, I thought he was nuts. I said, what are you telling me I'm addiction? He said, that's right, you are addiction. He says the first step is the things of your past, and the things of your past you brought into recovery. The next 10 steps would become your future. Not the next 11 steps, but the next 10 steps. And he said to me, when you come in and you start working a first step, you need to do it right away. And when you become powerless, it's talking about surrender. When you admit you're powerless over the disease of addiction, what you're doing is accepting that. You see, once you accept that you're an addict, that's not enough. Once you accept that you're an addict, then you have to surrender to it internally. Because if you don't surrender internally that you're an addict and say, yeah, I'm an addict, so what? How many of us have said through the years, yeah, I'm an addict? We have to surrender to the fact that it's part of our disease of us and that our life was unmanageable. And he said the first step is like taking all your clothes off and standing in the middle of the interstate. Back then there was no interstate. Standing in the middle of Main Street. Now, if you stand in the middle of an interstate naked for too long, something's going to happen. And I don't think a chick's going to come by and pick you up. You're going to wind up going away to jail. And he said the second step is like putting new clothes on. So if you hear somebody saying to stay and work the first step forever, got a big problem. And he also told me I wasn't powerless over everything. And I hear people telling addicts, oh, you're powerless over everything. Well, if you go ask me to turn the lights on, I'm not powerless over going over there and turning the lights on. If you tell me to go out and look for a job, I'm not powerless going out and filling out applications or resumes. I'm powerless over the disease of addiction. And so when I go to a second step, I put new clothes on. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. As I informed my sponsor, my infinite wisdom, we'll skip 2 and 3 and go to 4. I'm not about this God stuff. And he looked at me and he said, why? I said, well, you got to understand, I'm an agnostic. And there was silence. A couple minutes later, he comes back at me and he says, Vito, why are you an agnostic and not an atheist? Now, nobody ever asked me that question before. So I had to meditate in my infinite wisdom, and I come back at him and said, just in case someday I die. Now, when you're in your 20s, you're never going to die. But just in case someday I die, and there happens to be this thing called God, I want God to know that I was just an agnostic. I didn't know. I wasn't one of those damn atheists. And he looked at me and he said, there's no such thing as an agnostic. It's nothing more than a chicken atheist. Now, can you imagine your sponsor calling you chicken? Then he goes on to say there's no such thing as an atheist. So don't tell me there's no such thing as an atheist. I met those guys. They don't believe in nothing. He says, you ask any atheist or somebody that says they're an atheist, if they believe that the sun will rise in the morning and set at night. Well, I said, of course it'll rise in the morning. That's the universe. It's orderly direction. He said, well, then on a scale of 1 to 10, a 10 is somebody who believes in a religious God. All the way down the scale to 0 is in between. And on 0 is somebody who believes that there's orderly direction in the universe. He says, so everybody believes in a higher power. It's just a different perception. And that made sense to me. And then he says, you don't meet God, dummy, till the third step. And I said, don't dope feed me. I go to meetings, I hear people talking about a power greater than themselves and a higher power in the same breath. He said, they're wrong. He said, a power greater than yourself could be anything. In your addiction, you had a power greater than yourself. How many mornings did you get up and say, I am not going to use today? And within 5 minutes, you were cooking up and shooting up. That's a power greater than yourself. You were using against your will. But that was a negative power greater than yourself. In recovery, anything that makes you aware of the insanity of doing something over and over again and expecting to get a different result, that whatever makes you aware of that is a power greater than yourself. It can be something somebody shares at a meeting, something found in literature, even something an earth person would say that makes you stop, take a look at it, and do it different. That's a power greater. And someday, even if you believe in God, that God is not going to open the skies and send angels down to work with Vito. That God's going to work through people, places, and things. I have to be open for the message. And then it was time to go on to that third step. You know, the ones that we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. And I said, I can't do that. That's got the G-O-D word in it. He said, Vito, read the last part of the step. So, read it. Turn it over to the care of God as we understood Him. He says, you see, it says understood Him. That means you don't have to have the same understanding as anybody else. If you could relate to a rock in the backyard that was loving and caring, that could be the God of your understanding. But I don't even think you're that cuckoo. And then he asked me a question that nobody ever asked me before. He says, do you know why that step says God as we understood Him and not God as we understand Him? And my answer was in my cocky attitude, what's the difference? Understood, understand? And he said, because if that said God as we understand Him, it would mean Narcotics Anonymous would have an understanding of God. And because it says God as we understood Him, means as we walk in the rooms, each one of us can have a personal understanding of God. And they don't have to be the same. And that's why when those steps were written, they chose the word understood very carefully instead of understand. And it started off and said, we made a decision. And the decision is a starting point, a beginning, a commitment. You know, a lot of people say, well, it's only a decision. They'll go to the basic text and they'll read a sentence where it says, it's only a decision. But they forget 2 sentences down where it says a decision is a commitment. Because you're making a commitment when you make the decision to try. And, you know, there's a story going around that drives me nuts. People think that I'm prejudiced against frogs. But you hear these old-timers tell the newcomer, there's 3 frogs on the log. 2 of them jumped in. Which one made the decision? And of course, the newcomer says, well, the two that jumped in. The old-timer says, no, all 3 of them, because it's only a decision. Well, I hate to think what's going to happen to the frog that stayed on the log. He's going to wind up starving to death while the other 2 swam and found food. Because it requires a commitment, a decision. And a decision is a commitment. So when you read things in the basic text, it's very good to take a line out of context and not finish the complete thought in that particular paragraph, because it talks about commitment after it says that it's just a decision. And so we have to make a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God. Doesn't mean we can do it, but we made the commitment to keep trying. And if we keep trying, eventually it's going to happen. It's just like the relapser. If they keep coming back, eventually they're going to get this program. Because what could be harder than going out and relapse and come back with your tail between your legs? That's a strong desire to stop using. And we have to recognize that about our people that come back. We don't shoot our wounded. So when it tells us we made a commitment to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood it, what is our will and our life? Well, if you look at the dictionary, your life is everything that's happened in your life. It's a complete composite of everything that goes on in your life. And what is your will? Your reaction to everything that happens in your life. And if you're a typical addict, this is how it goes. Your girlfriend breaks up with you. Oh, God, I'm in pain. Boom, I'm going to go out and use. You wake up in the morning, and since you've lost your job 6 months ago, the finance company has just repossessed your pickup trucks. Damn it, you're going to go out and use. You see, that's how we are. We react. Our first thought, we don't want to feel that pain. And when we were kids, the old folks, our parents, teachers, whoever they were, they gave us a tool that really works well with the third step. But we never really put the correlation. How many of you heard when you were kids, count to 10 or 15 before you open your mouth? Most of us did. You know the reason for that is? So you could stop your first thought and think it through before you open your mouth. And see, the whole key of the third step is to take an addict and stop him from reacting or her from reacting and learn how to respond. And once we learn how to respond, then we're going to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood it. Because our reaction is what gets us in trouble. And we learn how to respond. We keep quiet long enough to think it through. We think about, well, yeah, my girl broke up with me and I got a lot of pain. And if I go out and use, then I got to get clean all over again because I'm going to run out of money. I'll wind up in jail. And if we take that pause, then we have a chance to think it through. But if we just want to fill that hurt in our gut, we're going to go out and use. And that's why we have to learn how to respond. And how many sponsors talk to their sponsees about the third step of not reacting and learn how to respond? One of the greatest tools there are of the third step. You see, the first 3 steps are the foundation of recovery. They will keep you clean for a while. It is not okay to be physically clean and spiritually dirty. How many people you see with decades clean, and they wear a sign on their back that says, I'm number 113 stepper. Well, hell, I got 20-some years clean. It is not okay to be clean and spiritually dirty. It's not okay to take a tent and pitch it outside a detox and wait for the people to come out so you can hit on them. And I'm not talking about the men either. There's many women who are 13 steppers too. Equal opportunity recovery program. But, we have to be spiritually clean. And that's why steps 4 through 9 keep us spiritually, emotionally, and mentally clean. Back in the old days, we used to have people coming in, and we call them 2-steppers. They'd work the first step and go immediately to the 12th step. And they'd stay clean on a little bit of service for a while, but they'd relapse. Because in the 12 steps, it tells us, as a result of these principles, talking about the previous 11, we had a spiritual awakening and we carried them to other addicts. Well, damn it, if you only work the first step, there ain't much you can carry. And in the 4th step, it tells us we made a fearless, searching, moral inventory. And of course, where I was in my recovery, I said to my sponsor, what are morals? I had no idea what morals were, because the only philosophy I had in life was I was going to get you before you get me. That was the code of the street, and I believe it's the same way today, too. And he told me what morals were, and he told me to start using a dictionary. And he told me to write about, and we didn't have a 4th-step guide then. And he told me things to write on, such as relationships and resentments and things like that. But what he had me do, he wanted me to write about how I felt when I was creating it in my addiction. He wanted me to go back into my innermost past and go in touch with the feelings the way it was. And when I finished writing about them, then go back and write about the same things on how I feel about those things today. See, the first writing would tell me where I was and what my mindset was. And when I went back and wrote about the same things from my perspective of where I was today, it shows me and my sponsor how much I've grown. Because even though other people could see I was changing, I couldn't see. And I needed those pats on the back. And by writing about it, when I occurred and how I felt, and how I felt now, showed me that I was growing. And that gave me the confidence and the inspiration and motivation to continue working the steps. And when it was time to do the 5th step, I remember I made it, my sponsor would constantly make it, go back, recheck it. Because I was one of these people, I started my 4th step, and 24 hours later I said, I'm done. And he said, if I knew you wanted to go confession, I'd drop you off at a Catholic church. So finally he gave me the day that he said it's okay to do the 5th step. And we met in a little town called Chula Vista, which is halfway between San Diego and Tijuana. And it was all rolling desert back in those days, and we sat on some rocks, and I had all this writing and everything, and my sponsor's going to be locked up for a month with me. And I started to read all this stuff, and he said, put those readings down. You're not reading nothing. I said, what did I write for? He said, you wrote for you. You were introducing Vito to Vito. You were priming the well. You remember when you used to call me up and say, I can't do this 4th step I'm going to use? And I would say, call guys in your support system, because that's exactly what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to churn those feelings up. Now that you've written it, you glance down at what you wrote, and you talk from your gut about what you feel. And a lot more came out of my gut than was on that paper. You see, because what we were trying to get to was the exact nature of my wrongs. Not my wrongs. If I had an anger problem, that was not the exact nature. If I had a jealousy problem, that was not the exact nature. If I had a larceny problem, that wasn't the exact nature. What's going on inside of me that causes all these things? I needed to get to the exact nature of my wrongs. And by sharing with him, he told me exactly what my problem. It's not that you get angry. It's why you get angry. Because you feel like a piece of shit most of the time. You feel less than. And so it's covered up with the anger. The anger is not the problem. It's the exact nature. And we went through a whole bunch of things. And when it was done, it was time to move on for the 6th step. And isn't it funny? The 6th step follows the 5th step. We became entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character. And this is when this agnostic said to his sponsor, is this when I get on my knees and ask God to take them away? And he laughed at me. He said, you can do that if you want. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's nothing in the step that says God's going to take them away. It says Vito became entirely ready to let the process start. And I said, well, how do I do that? He says, take a piece of paper, like this. Draw a line down the center. On the one side of the line, you list all the defects and patterns that we talked about in the 5th step. On this side of the line, draw their opposites. Here's where you are, this is where you want to go. Roadmap to recovery. And he explained the difference to me between a defect and a shortcoming. He said, even though they're rooted in the same word, there is a difference. A defect is part of who I am, part of my personality, part of my character. The shortcoming is acting out the defect. And so if I don't act out the defect, I don't have a shortcoming. And so he had me get busy writing and doing it. And he explained to me, actually he didn't explain it to me. My wife that passed away explained to me. I even learned something from my wife. How about that? She said to me, the 6th step is packing the suitcase, and the 7th step is taking the trip. Because a lot of people confuse the 6 and 7, and they want to put them together. So when it was time to go to the 7th step, we humbly asked him to remove these shortcomings. And I said, is this where you get on your knees and pray and God takes them away? And again, same answer. You can if you want. That's not how it happens. An addict becomes humble when they own their stuff. Now, male addicts have a hard time owning their stuff. I can't speak for females, because I don't think I was, at least in this lifetime, I was never a female. But, you'll hear men say, well, I may not be right, but I'm not wrong. The ladies have heard that before, if they get that humble to even say that. See, because as male addicts, we have this hard thing of owning our stuff. But when addicts start owning that stuff, that's the humility that they're talking about in the 7th step. And once we become humble in that respect, we can remove those shortcomings through the first 3 steps. Now, at that time in my life, I had a hard time staying in a relationship because I suffered from something called vicious jealousy rage. You know, the kind of jealousy that you speak with your hands before your mouth? And even a female addict isn't going to stay in that kind of a relationship for very long. And what he told me to do is when I begin to feel that rage building up in me, I had to go down to a first step, and I had to get in touch with that feeling of rage going on inside. Don't deny it. Hug it. Embrace it. Feel every part of my body. Feel that rage. Feel myself coming apart. And then go to a second step and see the insanity if I act out on it. And then go to a third step and take those feelings and turn them over to the God of my understanding, asking for help and guidance on not to act out. Then go back to a second step and do it different. Did it go away overnight? No. But by continually doing that, I haven't had that problem in 40-some years. So these steps work. They're the answer to everything. And I had to work that same formula, the first 3 steps, on every one of my shortcomings. And then it was time to go on to the 8th step, where we made a list and became willing to make amends to all that we had harmed. Well, I informed my sponsor in my infinite wisdom that when I become willing, I'll make the list. And he said, read the step. Whoever put these steps together had to be a genius, because it said we made the list and then become willing. So I had no choice but to follow direction. So, okay, I'll make that list, but I'm not willing. You don't understand. Everybody owes me Christmas presents. And of course, being an addict, once you make the list, then all of a sudden you want to make amends to the whole world. And that's why we have a sponsor to do the 9th step for. Because left our own devices, we'll cause more damage than we'll do good. And we went over that list in the 9th step, and he would say, you need to make a direct amends here. But over here, don't you dare make a direct amends, because you're going to cause more damage. You don't go up to your grandmother and say, hey, Gram, remember when your diamond disappeared? Hello. But you make amends anonymously. You know, there's financial amends that have to be made. You know, we went over that list, each one. No, you don't do that because you're going to cause more damage, but you're not off free. This is how you make the amends. And then there was all those faceless people, you know, like 2 ships passing in the night. You don't really know who they were. In and out of your life fast. And he says, those amends have to be made too, and you need to make them through your higher power. And if your higher power feels that you need to make a direct amends, guess what? They will show up in your life, and you'll know why they're there. And I've had people show up 16, 17 years later, and there's no coincidences in recovery. They were there because it was time. My higher power felt it was time to put them back in my life for whatever reason. But I had to do my side of the street, and I had to make amends. And then it has a strange thing at the end of the 9th step. And it says, and others. Why is that there? Because I'm part of others. I don't walk into the 46th precinct in the Bronx and say in 1957 there was a gang stomping outside of PS 118 on the corner of Arthur Avenue and 179th Street, and somebody may have died. Do you have any cold cases? I'm sure they would help me out. I mean, I don't even know if something happened to somebody. He said, you got to have common sense. And you didn't come in this far in recovery to injure yourself, because the greatest rehabilitation that you make is changing yourself. And we went through a few different things, and he said, well, this one you need to do. This one you don't need to do. You need to change. You need to be a different person. And we went through all those different things. And then it was time to go on to the 10th step. And I was told 10 through 12 were the growth and maintenance steps. We maintain what we got through the first 9, and we grow on top of them. You know, the 10th step said we continue to take personal inventory. And when we were wrong, promptly admit it. I said to my sponsor, no problem, I know how to say I'm sorry. He says, yeah, you suffer from sorryitis. Addicts love that word, I'm sorry. He said that's not what the step's talking about. What that step says, we continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admit it. Promptly admitting it is wrong. It's talking about self-honesty. When I go through the reflection of my day, when I was wrong, I have to promptly admit it to myself, because if I don't admit it to me, nothing changes. Sure, it's okay to go out and make apologies, but unless I become honest with myself of what's happening and make an effort not to keep making the same mistake over and over again, 10th step means absolutely nothing. The 10th step is a reflection of my day and check and balance to keep me on course. It also tells me where I need to take the elevator down to the first 3 steps to work on a problem. You see, we always take the steps up, but we can take the elevator down and re-walk up the steps. And if something reoccurs in my life, I better start working the first 3 steps on them. And so the 10th step is very vital. And I did a written 10th step for maybe 18, 19 years. I'll be honest with you, I do not do a written 10th step today, but before my head hits the pillow and I fall asleep, I reflect through my day. I've written so many years at it, it's an automatic thing that I do a 10th step as my head hits the pillow. It's a lifetime thing. Growth and maintenance. Maintenance, maintenance. The 11th step, which I consider the end of the steps, because the 12th step is the portal into the world. It talks about how's it go? We continue to pray. We continue to improve our conscious contact with God through prayer and meditation, praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. We sought through prayer and meditation. So it's telling us we sought through prayer and meditation. We're seekers. You know, all of our problem, our entire life, is we had this big hole in our belly, and we tried to fill it with drugs, lust, money, material things, and it never did. And so we start seeking through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact. Through prayer and meditation, very important part. So it's telling us we need to improve it, which means we should have been doing it long before we got to the 11th step. Now, some of our literature says praying is asking and meditation is listening, and that's pretty much true. But I think meditation is the greatest form of prayer there is, because if you reach conscious contact, you don't need to ask for anything. There was a writer that in one of his books said that if you don't go within, you go without. And I believe that's a very strong statement, because our 11th step tells us that we need to improve our relationship with God through prayer and meditation. And if you got problems with the word God, He's in about 5 of the steps directly and indirectly in some. So He was here before you, so get with your sponsor. I hear people say, well, if you mention God in NA meeting, you're going to drive addicts out. That may be true, but God's going to drive them back in. We are a spiritual program, and God is in our steps. So if you want to be blind and say there's no God in NA, I don't know what set of steps you work. And it goes on to say, praying only for the knowledge of God's will for you. My sponsor told me one thing one time that lasted a lifetime. He told me how to find out what God's will is for me. Now, that may sound egotistical, but it's very simple. He says, with any situation in your life, step out of the box, become emotionally unattached to it, look at it as an observer, and look at it as an observer and say to yourself, what is the best or the highest good for everybody in that situation? And that will always be God's will. But if I put my 2 cents in there, you better believe it's going to be what's the highest good for me. But I have to step aside and look at it very objectively and ask, what is the highest good for everybody in this situation? That will be God's will. And that's why the end of the step, it says praying for the power to carry it out. Because I may know what God's will is, but I have to pray like hell to be able to carry it out sometimes, because it's not my will, and sometimes I want to see you suffer and hurt. And that's not very spiritual. But it's part of my disease. And so I have to be in check and practice that on a regular basis. My home group's an 11-step group, conscious contact group. And we actually have 10 minutes of silent meditation at that meeting. And then we open the meeting up, and then a speaker shares their experience with the 11th step, and then we have discussion. And you're finding more and more NA meetings showing up with 11 steps because we finally grew up. When I walked in this fellowship, if you mentioned God, we'd want to beat you up. And today it's a little bit different. We've actually worked some steps and got some spirituality in our life. And I'm not talking about religious, because I'm not necessarily a religious person. But I understand I'm a spiritual person, and I go to a spiritual program, and so I better be working spiritual principles. The 12th step sums it all up. It says, as a result of these steps, what steps? The previous 11. We had a spiritual awakening. What is that awakening? These steps work. You don't need Einstein for a sponsor to figure that one out. These steps work. They're the answer to any problem. Will they cure a financial problem? No. But what they will cure is me getting through that problem and not picking up. Will they cure a relationship problem? No. But what they will do is help me get through the pain of that relationship problem without picking up. Anything in life, the steps is always the answer, because it will get me through without going out and getting all screwed up. And then it says, we carry this message to other addicts. What message? The steps work. I have people, I'm doing 12-step work. What are you doing? I'm going and talking about Narcotics Anonymous. Well, if you're not talking about the steps, you're not doing 12-step work. But of course, you have to work and live the steps in your life before you can talk about it. And how many people stay year after year in here? They've never gone through the steps. They'll want a sponsor that they can call occasionally, and the sponsor doesn't say, what are you doing with your steps? Just checking in. Well, you can check in after you work the steps with your sponsor and start working steps with sponsees. So it tells us we try to carry this message to other addicts. The message, and then the kicker, and practice these principles in all of our affairs. In other words, I'm not off the hook. I got to still work on myself. And that's why we have the steps in the program. They're not there for decoration on the wall. They're there because it's part of this program. You know, I came around here for a long time, and I kicked and I fought, and I didn't want to do the steps. But if I never did the steps, I wouldn't be here today, and I know that is a fact. This program has saved my life. You know, we used to have symbols at conventions, and it was always these lifesavers from on a ship. And it would always signify what Narcotics Anonymous is. It is a lifesaver. And I read some statistics, and I'm not one big on statistics, but there's one that said that people who go to 12-step programs, who work the steps on a regular basis, have a 95% rate of not relapsing, and those that don't work steps in their life have a 95% of relapsing. So if you're looking at people who have been here for a long time, they've either worked the steps or they got some constitution that they can take a lot of pain. I don't know what it is. But I have a tendency to believe that they work the steps to the best of their ability. And you know, the greatest way to learn the steps is work them with other addicts. That really keeps you sharp and keeps you on your toe. And I've been up here a while, and I'm going to end this right now. I want to tell one story. It'll be very short. It's about one of my heroes. And one of my heroes helped this guy called Joe Attic. I think that most of the people in this room know Joe Attic. And poor Joe, he woke up one morning and he had a bad hair day. Has anybody in here ever had a bad hair day? You know, where everything goes wrong. Well, Joe went out and he got stoned the night before. And he went into blackout and they got robbed. They took his stash. He woke up in the morning, he had nothing. Now, you know what it is to wake up in the morning and have nothing. Now, all of a sudden, you're pissed off, you got a bad hair day, you got to go out and do a hustle. So Joe says, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do my hustle. I got a cop. I'm getting sick now, and I don't have too much time before I get sick. So Joe goes out, and he's going down the street, and his mind's going, and he's looking up at the sky, trying to figure out what the hustle's going to be, where's he going to go, where's he going to find people, where he can do this thing. All of a sudden, some damn city worker left the manhole cover open. Down goes Joe, 14 feet under the street. And he starts going into detox. And the razor blades in his belly, and he's crying, oh, the dragons of hell are on my ass, and I'm going to die. Just get it over with. Just let me die. I don't want to live like this. And he's carrying on and on and on. He's making a commotion. And here's footsteps. Somebody's walking down the street. And guy says, hey, what's going on down there? He says, well, I'm Joe Attic, and I'm dying from the disease of addiction, and there's a hope for me, and the dragons of hell are here, and I just want to die. Guy says, well, you're in luck. I'm a man of the cloth, and I got my Bible with me. I'm going to pray over you. Man takes out his book and prays over Joe and says, Joe, you're in good hands. I'm going to leave. God's going to save you. Well, 45 minutes gone by. Joe's still getting deeper in detox. Nobody's saving him, and he just wants to die. And he's carried on and on and on. And another set of footsteps, and somebody yells down there, hey, what's going on down there? And I'm Joe Attic, and I'm dying of the disease of addiction. And there's no help for me at all. I just want to die. I don't want to feel this pain. The guy said, well, you're in luck. I'm an MD. And I have my prescription pad. He said, well, let's see. You need some Oxycontins, a little Percocet. Oh, we'll throw in some Suboxone on top of it. Now get this filled, Joe, and you're going to be okay. Well, of course, he drops it down in there, and there's no help for Joe. Joe can't get out. Anyway, he ain't got no money to fill no prescription. Otherwise, he wouldn't look for a hustle. And he's going on and on and on. And he hears a very, very light footsteps coming by. And somebody yells down to him with just a very tiny bit of a Scottish brogue. And says, what's going on down there? He says, I'm Joe the Attic, and I'm dying of the disease of addiction, and there's no hope for people like me, and I just want to die. I don't want to feel anymore. I just can't take it anymore. And all of a sudden, this little skinny, frail man jumps down into this manhole 14 feet below the street. And Joe looks at him and says, are you crazy, man? Now there's two of us, and there's no way out. And the man looks at him and he says, Joe, my name is Jimmy Kinnan. I founded Narcotics Anonymous. I've been here before, and I know the way out. Thanks for letting me share.
Thanks, Vito.